We extend a warm welcome to you all to Winter School 2023 Distinguished Session 2 by Professor Jordi Gali. Without further delay, I now invite our esteemed chairperson, Professor Pamidua, to commence the session.
Once again, Professor Jordi Gali for his second lecture today. And this is on understanding economic fluctuations, the new Keynesian perspective. I request Professor Gali to start his lecture, and I may also mention graciously he has agreed to take questions during his lecture, but the questions during the lecture should be only for clarification of the material he is presenting. All other questions will have to be taken at the end of the session. So thank you, Professor Gali.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for coming back this afternoon. That means that maybe the lecture in the morning was not a complete disaster, or that you're just curious to see, how we fix some of all the contradictions that we were left with by the neoclassical perspective. Okay. So I'll just jump right in, and again, this morning I introduced this notion of wedges, and I argued that this was a very general, in a sense, completely general way of departing from the neoclassical framework. Of course, one has to give content to those wedges. What determines those wedges? Okay, so you need a complete model to do so. And what I will do this afternoon is to propose one such model, which is the new Keynesian model, and we'll see basic incarnations of that new Keynesian framework. And we'll see, how they differ from the neoclassical perspective in terms of some of the implications and so on. So, when introducing the neoclassical framework this morning, I emphasized two assumptions that were the key assumptions. The rest were kind of auxiliary, but the two key assumptions were perfect competition in all markets and flexible prices, including flexible wages, combined with the idea that there is some mechanism in the background, but typically not modeled explicitly, that guarantees that wages and prices are adjusted so that all markets clear simultaneously. How that happens is kind of magic, but that's the assumption. So here we're going to depart from those two assumptions. Okay. So the first departure is departure from perfect competition, and we're going to assume that there is market power in goods and labor markets. Okay, which means that individuals, firms, workers, or unions representing workers, they perceive that they face some demand constraint. Okay? So they no longer believe that they can sell as much as they want of the good they want to sell at given market prices, but instead they face some demand constraint. And not only that, but they can set, or they have an influence on the prices or wages that apply to the good or the service they sell. Okay? So here, the new Keynesian model, the standard, the baseline new Keynesian model adopts a particular form of, has a particular way of introducing this market power, which is through the formalism of monopolistic competition, okay? Which each individual agent is small enough to take aggregates as given, okay? But still, it produces some differentiated good or service, and this differentiation makes it possible to have, endows that agent with some market power. Okay, so this existence of this market power means that markups will be positive. Okay, desired markups. Okay, I'm going to introduce this concept of desired markups. That is, the markups that agents would want to maintain in the absence of other constraints are positive. Okay, they may be small, they may be large, but positive, both in the goods market and the labor market in the general model. Okay, so that's the first assumption, and the second assumption is that prices and wages, or prices or wages, are sticky. That is, there are some constraints either on the frequency of adjustment of prices and wages, or there are some adjustment costs of prices and wages. The details are not critical for our purposes here, but there's something that prevents prices and wages from moving rapidly in response to shocks, and well, that will have some implications. Now, the second assumption implies that in equilibrium, in response to shocks, that is outside the steady state, markups will deviate from desired markups. Okay? But the interesting, and this is a very interesting insight that goes back to work by Akerlof and Yellen and Mankiw. Those deviations from desired markups may not imply large losses for the individual agents. The losses may be of second order, as long as they are not large deviations, of course. Okay? But they may have first order effects for the economy as a whole. Okay? So when I use, I don't know if it's a good terminology or not, but it's the one that comes to mind, the notion of elastic markups. That is, individual agents are happy or are willing to deviate from their desired markups. Okay? And so they will be willing to meet changes in demand for their good or their service, even if this implies some deviation, as long as it's not too large, of course, from the desired markup. Okay? So that's what I call elastic markups. So in terms of the terminology of this morning, it would be those wedges, they can change. They're relatively flexible, the markups. The prices and wages are sticky, but the counterpart to that is that the markups have to be flexible. That agents should be willing to accept these fluctuations in markups. Very good. So what I will do next is to describe, some of you are familiar with this. I understand some of you have even used my textbook. So I usually take 20 hours to teach a course based on my textbook. I'm not going to, in a sense, I'm going to try to convey most of the messages in the hour and a few extra minutes that I will have without getting into the details, okay? But many of you may find this familiar material. And then at the end, I'll describe one interesting case, an interesting, and what I think is an interesting illustration of how different the implications of this model are from the standard neoclassical model. And this will have to do with wage flexibility. Okay, so the conventional wisdom that we inherit from the neoclassical view that we learned from Economics 101, is that flexible wages are desirable. Okay, we'll see that it's not necessarily the case. Okay, once one adopts this alternative framework. Again, we'll have, the notation is similar to this morning. We have an infinitely representative household with these preferences here. I don't know why I generalized the utility function to be a CRRA. This morning we had log utility. It doesn't really matter. Okay, think of sigma being equal to 1 if you want. And here, just because there are some derivations that I really won't get into in the slides, they are somewhat simpler if we assume constant returns to labor. Everything, the whole thing goes through with decreasing returns to labor as we had this morning, so that's not really important, okay? So this is essentially the same. Now, one key difference here, this morning, we assumed that there were many identical firms that were producing homogeneous goods under perfectly competitive, in a perfectly competitive environment. Here, we're going to assume that there are different consumption goods. Okay, so this CT is a bundle. Okay, it's a CES bundle of the quantities of the different consumption goods. So they are imperfect substitutes, and there is one firm that produces each differentiated good. Okay, so that's indexed by I. And there is a continuum represented by the unit interval. And the assumption, the standard assumption, is that demand for each good is isoelastic, which means that under monopolistic competition, the desired markup will be constant, okay, and will be a function, a well-known function of the price elasticity of demand. Now, so that's one assumption. The second one is here. First, I will start with a version of the model with perfect competition and in the labor market and flexible wages, and then I will introduce these imperfections in the labor market. So in the baseline version, there's only imperfect monopolistic competition in the goods market and sticky prices. But wages are fully flexible and the labor market is perfectly competitive. Okay, so we'll do one step at a time to understand the role of each. Okay, and then just for simplicity, I assume a closed economy, no capital accumulation. This is not really critical for any of the messages that I will try to convey. Okay, now, so this model, as I have described it, generates some equilibrium conditions, that describe the dynamics of the model, and those are the equilibrium conditions. Okay, after you combine many optimality conditions, market clearing conditions, you can summarize the equilibrium of the model with these three equations, and that's why many people refer to this simple version of the new Keynesian model as the three-equation model. Okay, so these are the three equations. So let me, for those of you who may not be that familiar with this, I will describe each of the equations and then briefly show you where they come from. Okay, so that you don't take this as just as given. So the first equation is critical. It's a central equation of the new Keynesian model, which distinguishes it from old-fashioned Keynesian models, the so-called new Keynesian Phillips curve. And it relates inflation, so pi t will be the first difference of the log of the price level, so that corresponds to approximately the growth rate of the price level, so that's what we call inflation. It relates inflation to expected inflation. This is the representative household discount factor. And this driving variable, if you want, which we will call the output gap. So what is the output gap? Well, the output gap, the word output gap is a term that people use in different ways in the profession. It's unfortunate. But in the context of this literature, the output gap has a very well-defined meaning. It's the log deviation between output and the natural level of output, where the natural level of output is defined as the equilibrium level of output in the absence of nominal rigidities. Okay, so it's like a counterfactual level of output. The level of output that we would observe in equilibrium if prices and wages were all flexible. Okay? And the output gap is just a gap relative to that by definition must be the result of the presence of some nominal rigidities, because otherwise the output gap will be zero. Then there is a second, so this equation determines inflation, if you want, as a result of fluctuations in the output gap. And then we have a second equation that determines the output gap, okay, as a function of another gap. And what's this other gap? So here we have the nominal rate. I'm introducing notation that I had not introduced. This is expected inflation. So the difference between the two is what we call the real rate, okay? And this object here is what we will call the natural rate of interest. And the natural rate of interest is the equilibrium rate of interest that one would observe in the absence of nominal rigidities. Okay? So you can see, just how do we know that? Well, if there were no nominal rigidities, the output gap would be zero at all times, so necessarily the real interest rate would be equal to this object. Okay, so in that sense, we can interpret it as the natural rate of interest. I'll show you how this can be derived. Okay, and then there is a third equation that describes monetary policy. And of course, monetary policy can be conducted in many different ways, so this third equation can take many different forms. But a conventional way of modeling monetary policy is through a Taylor rule. That's what I wrote down here. It's a rule that instructs the central bank to set the interest rate in response to fluctuations of inflation with a certain coefficient that determines the strength of that response, and in response to fluctuations in output. This is not the output gap, it's not, no, you have a hat now instead of a tilde. This is the deviation of output from a steady state output. Okay? So that's something that matches the specification of the interest rate rule that John Taylor argued captured well the behavior of or the decisions made by the Federal Reserve Bank in a particular period, the Greenspan era, and then has been shown by many authors to capture well the behavior of independent central banks in many countries and under many different regimes, as long as the country or the central bank does not have a mandate that involves the exchange rate. So this, under a fixed exchange regime, this wouldn't make any sense. The objective of the central bank is not stabilizing inflation and output, it's stabilizing the exchange rate. Okay, but it doesn't matter. One could write down an alternative rule in which the central bank responds to the exchange rate, or even impose a fixed exchange rate. In the case of an open economy, this is a closed economy. Okay, very good. So we can think of this as a realistic interest rate rule, as opposed to an optimal monetary policy rule. And this VT captures monetary policy shocks. There is deviations, exogenous deviations from the rule. You can think of these as monetary policy mistakes, changes in preferences of the members of the Monetary Policy Committee, whatever you want. Okay? Very good. Now, so this is the model. One could solve for this. I'll show you some simulations of the model, but let me just take some time to describe where these equations come from. Okay? In particular, the new Keynesian Phillips curve. So the assumption in standard versions of the model is an assumption that people associate with the name of Guillermo Calvo, because he's the first one who introduced this formalism, if you want, is that each firm has a constant probability of adjusting the price in any given period, independently of the time that has elapsed since the last adjustment. And that probability is 1 minus theta, okay? So that means that the probability of keeping the price unchanged is theta. By the law of large numbers, the fraction of firms that will not adjust their price will be theta. So that allows us to interpret theta in a natural way as a measure of price rigidities. Okay, obviously theta has to be between 0 and 1. Okay. Now one can show that in this environment, the aggregate price level in logs follows this difference equation, where PT star is the price set by firms that adjust prices in period T. Okay? So the price level is a weighted average of the prices, the average price of those firms that do not adjust prices, they have a weight theta, and the price set by those firms that adjust prices. And turns out that by symmetry, all the firms adjusting prices today will choose the same price, PT star. Okay? And what's the measure of those firms? It's 1 minus theta. So then the question is, what is PT star? How is that PT star determined? Well, PT star is determined as the outcome of an optimization problem by the firm. When the firm has a chance to adjust its price, it maximizes its value. Its current value, which is some expected discounted sum of its future profits, properly discounted. Okay? Taking into account, taking into account the fact that the price will be readjusted only with a certain probability. And it is this fact that makes the problem dynamic. Okay? The firm should when setting the price today, should not take into account only of the impact that this will have on today's profits, but also on future profits, because with some probability that price will remain effective for many periods. Okay? So that solving that problem, okay, obviously I want to go through the derivation of the solution to that problem, gives rise to an optimality condition that can be approximated to a first order to look like this. So what this says is that the firm that gets to adjust the price today will choose a price in logs, PT star, that is equal to this mu. What is this mu? This is the log of the desired markup. I will call it just the markup or the log markup. Okay, the desired markup or the natural markup is given by this formula that must be familiar to all of you, epsilon divided by epsilon minus 1, where epsilon is the price elasticity of demand. So that's the markup that the firm would want to maintain if it could adjust the price every period. It cannot do so, but what it does is to choose a price that is equal to the desired markup, not over its current marginal cost, which is what the firm would do if the price was flexible, but over a weighted average of current and expected future marginal costs. So, and why do those expectations of marginal cost enter the rule, the price setting rule, the optimal price setting rule? Because firms recognize that their price that they choose today may remain effective for a number of periods, so they have to take into account not only the current marginal cost when setting that price, but also expected future marginal costs. Okay? And the weights, you know, the weights given on those future expectations will depend on theta. Okay? These weights will decline more slowly if theta is high, that is, if prices are very sticky. Okay? So this is critical because it makes the price setting, it makes the price the price setting decision forward-looking decision, and inflation will inherit that forward-looking property. Inflation will be forward-looking here. Very good. Now under flexible prices, that's a limiting case of this. If theta equals 0, you can see that the price, all firms would be adjusting prices and they would choose a price that is equal to the desired markup over the current marginal cost. Very good. One can combine the two equations, and after some derivations, some algebra, one can get this difference equation for inflation. So what this says is that inflation depends on expected inflation, and it's inversely related to the gap between the average markup. Okay, so mu t is the actual markup, actual average markup, so it's the price level minus the marginal cost, average, okay, in the economy, and the desired markup. Again, because of price rigidities, because this price stickiness, there will generally be a gap between the two, okay? So that gap is the driving force behind inflation. I think this is one of the most interesting insights of the new Keynesian framework, because as I have kind of jokingly, when I was referring to the neoclassical framework, I was saying that, you know, prices and wages adjust always, we don't know how, so that all markets clear. Here, prices do not adjust, I don't know how. We know how. Inflation is the result of price-setting decisions by actual agents, firms. And those price-setting decisions are purposeful, and they aim at maximizing its value, okay? So, when will there be positive inflation in the economy? There will be positive inflation when the average markup in the economy is below the desired markup. Because when the average markup in the economy is below the desired markup, those firms that get to adjust price, on average, will try to increase the price, so in order to realign their markup to the desired markup. And that will create positive inflation. Okay, so at least this framework allows us to understand what's behind changes in the price level or changes in inflation, or decisions by individuals, not a Walrasian auctioneer that makes sure that all markets clear at all times. And this coefficient is a function of different parameters, including the price stickiness parameter theta. Okay, so in particular, the larger is theta, the smaller is this lambda coefficient, and the smaller will be the response of inflation to the markup gaps. Okay, I'm going to refer to this as the markup gap. Very good. So that's a key equation that is very robust. It holds under many environments. dependently of whether it's capital, economy is open, closed, fiscal policy, doesn't matter. Now, in order to go from this equation to the new Keynesian Phillips curve that I showed you earlier, there is an additional step. And that additional step involves auxiliary assumptions. So depending on details of the model, it will take a certain form or another. Under the simplest assumptions, namely perfect competition in the labor market, as I'm assuming, flexible wages and so on, closed economy, no fiscal sector, and so on, it turns out, I won't go through the derivation, okay, that you can combine the expression for the price markup, price minus marginal cost, again assuming constant returns to labor for simplicity. Here we have the labor supply that we already had in the neoclassical view. We're assuming there's perfect competition in labor markets. This is the technology written, with employment on the left-hand side. This is the goods market equilibrium, I'm assuming that all output is consumed. If you combine all these equations with the previous price inflation equation, one gets an expression for just combining these equations, one gets an expression for the price markup as a function of output, as a function of technology. Okay, so this is general. Now, here we have it again. Now, so this holds independently of how sticky prices are. So in particular, it also holds when prices are flexible. But if prices are flexible, we know what the markup is. The markup equals the desired markup, mu without the t subscript, okay? So we can write down this equation, evaluated at the flexible price equilibrium. And now let me call output at the flexible price equilibrium, let me denote it by YTN. Okay, the natural, and again, it's a natural level of output, which I define as the equilibrium level of output under flexible prices. So I can solve this very simple model easily and by the natural level of output. And we see that in this model, the natural level of output depends exclusively on technology. It doesn't depend on the demand shock, that shock to the discount factor, ZT, that I have introduced. Certainly doesn't depend on monetary policy, okay, and the monetary policy shock. Why? Because, well, under flexible prices, it turns out that monetary policy is neutral, doesn't affect output, and the demand shock, the way I introduced it as a discount factor shock, it turns out that has no impact on aggregate output when prices are flexible, okay? The reason is that it doesn't shift, the shock to discount factor doesn't shift the labor supply, it doesn't enter the labor demand, so it has no impact on equilibrium employment, okay? Now, you can subtract, okay, so we keep this expression for the natural level of output. You can see that there are two things, the natural level of output will be inefficient because of the existence of this markup, okay? The larger is the markup, the lower will be the output, and that's a source of inefficiency, okay? But the markup, the existence of the markup itself, or the desired markup, that is the existence of market power itself, doesn't affect how the economy responds to shocks, okay? This would be independent, how the economy responds to shocks is independent of the degree of market power, okay, in an economy with flexible prices. Now, we can subtract this equation from this equation, and we get an expression for the markup gap as a function, simple proportional function of the output gap, okay? And now we can just plug this into the inflation equation that we had derived earlier, and we get the new Keynesian Phillips curve. Now, the new Keynesian, so here we see that there is a relationship between inflation and the output gap. But that takes a very simple form, but in our minds, certainly when I teach this to students, I always tell them, look, if you want to think about the mechanism behind fluctuations in inflation, the reason why an increase in the output gap increases inflation is because an increase in the output gap lowers the markup gap. And it is that, okay, the fact that markups are too low, that makes firms want to increase the prices. Okay, so that's the way I like to think about it, to understand why changes in the output gap lead to changes in inflation. You had a clarifying question?
How could the
Yes.
Have the same discount factor as the output.
That's right. Yes, yes. They are the only ones who can own the firms in the model. There's no one else. Very good. Now, just a couple of points on this new Keynesian Phillips curve. I said that it's the most distinctive ingredient of the new Keynesian model, so let me explain why. First, you can solve this new You can solve this new Keynesian Phillips curve forward, okay, and you obtain this expression. So this shows that inflation depends on the current output gap, but also on expectations of the future output gap. And it's independent of past inflation. Okay, so inflation is purely forward-looking. This is an extreme version of the model. Okay, there are extensions of the model in which you get what is known as hybrid new Keynesian Phillips curve, in which inflation also depends on lagged inflation. But in the pure version of the model, inflation is purely forward-looking. Where does this forward-lookingness comes? Well, it's a natural consequence of the forward-lookingness in price setting, okay, which in turn is an implication of sticky prices. Any model in which firms behave minimally rationally and they are subject to sticky prices, constraints on the adjustment of price and so on. In any of such model, the price setting decision will be a forward-looking decision. Okay. Very good. So that's the first observation. Second observation. Again, this is a consequence of this simple version of the model. No trade-off between inflation and output gap stabilization. In contrast with the traditional Phillips curve, in which the central bank was facing a trade-off, say, between stabilizing unemployment rate or stabilizing inflation, and had to decide which variable did it put more weight to. So here there's no trade-off. And this is a result that Olivier Blanchard and myself called the divine coincidence. That's a term that has caught up somehow. It says that, look, suppose that the central bank wants to stabilize the output gap. Well, the output gap is not really observable because the natural level of output is not directly observable, but it doesn't matter. The only thing that it has to do is to stabilize inflation, okay? If the central bank stabilizes inflation, I mean, you can see it here. Inflation is stabilized, the output gap will automatically be stabilized. In particular, if inflation is stabilized at zero, it's price stability, the output gap will be zero at all times. So that's what we call the divine coincidence, because it makes life relatively easy for a central bank operating in this environment, okay, if it wants to stabilize the output gap. And equivalently, if the central bank fully stabilizes the output gap, okay, automatically, you can see here, it will fully stabilize inflation, okay. Also, an implication of this is that these inflations are costless. That's a very strong implication, again, of this baseline, the simple baseline model, okay. Suppose that the country is experiencing a very high inflation or moderate inflation, and the central bank wants to reduce inflation permanently. Well, the only thing it has to do is to set or to steer the economy, okay, so that the output gap is zero. Not a negative output gap. Okay, so that doesn't necessarily have to generate a large recession. Just a zero output gap, output equal to an actual level, and that will be sufficient to bring down inflation to zero. Okay? And this is just a side remark, if you want. When it comes to this, is especially relevant if we want to take this to the data, as we did in some work with Mark Gertler some years ago. Many people were criticizing the new Keynesian Phillips curve on the grounds that it didn't fit the data. And so what they were doing they were running, they were estimating a model, one versions of this model, but what were they using as a proxy for the output gap? They were using the trended GDP. In fact, many economists would call the trended GDP the output gap. That's what I said. It's confusing, it's a source of confusion. We are using the same term to refer to different things, but I'm not going to change that equilibrium by myself, okay? So the point I want to make here is that this output gap, that is very well defined in the context of the model, is very different from the statistical notion of the output gap, namely the deviation of output from some deterministic trend, okay, some smooth function of time. Why? They may be very different because by definition, when people detrend, let's say log GDP, they assume that the trend is a smooth function of time, okay? That's why they call it a trend, I guess. But the natural level of output, there is no reason why the natural level of output should be a smooth function of time. It can fluctuate in response to many shocks, okay? In response to any shock that would lead to fluctuations in output in a world with flexible prices and flexible wages, okay? Fiscal shocks, technology shocks, whatever, okay? So that's why, what I say here complicates empirical assessment, but this distinction is very important to keep in mind. Very good. Don't worry, I won't go through all the details here, just where does the dynamic IS equation, the second equation of the model, come from? Well, it comes from combining, this is the consumption-Euler equation, the intertemporal optimality condition of the household's problem, okay, which relates consumption in logs to expected consumption. Well, it relates essentially the growth rate of consumption to the gap between the real interest rate and the discount rate, and here we have the discount factor shock. Now impose goods market clearing, so consumption equals to output, okay? And then, you go from an equation in terms of output, rewrite it in terms of the output gap by adding and subtracting the natural level of output. Okay, you get this expression here. Then all these terms here, you can move them inside the brackets, and you get this dynamic IS equation, the second equation that I mentioned, where RTN is equal to all this stuff here. Okay? And as I said earlier, this has the interpretation of the real interest rate that we would observe in equilibrium if prices were flexible. And we see here that the interest rate is a function of technology and is a function of the demand shock. Okay, so the demand shock cannot have, this demand shock, what I call this demand shock is the discount factor shock, cannot have an effect on output, but it has an effect on the real interest rate. Output in this model under flexible prices is determined exclusively by the supply side, okay, by technology, okay, in this simple version of the model. The demand shock affects the interest rate, but not output. Okay, so the way it works is, suppose that agents become impatient, okay, so they have an increase in ZT. Now that makes them want to consume more. But output is determined in equilibrium by the supply side. It will not change output. So in order to clear the goods market, the real interest rate magically, okay, under flexible prices, changes. It increases in order to offset that desire to consume more in the short run, okay, if agents suddenly become very impatient. Okay, so that's the natural rate of output. Okay, very good. So a key property of this is that, we can solve it forward by iterating forward, and we see that the output gap depends not only on the current real interest rates and the current natural rate, the current natural real rate, and the natural rate of interest, but also on the expected future value. So this is very important. Why? Because it will imply, in the context of this model, that not only current monetary policy will affect output, but also expectations about future monetary policy, okay, will affect output today. So that actually is behind many of the rationales provided by the model for some policies like forward guidance, which central bank, it tries to influence the economy not by changing interest rates, because maybe it cannot change interest rates, they are at the lower bound, but by influencing expectations about future interest rates. Please.
RTN is the natural rate of interest rate, right?
RTN.
RTN.
Yes.
And is it same as the Wickselian notion of?
Yes, some people refer it to as the Wickselian rate. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
Clarificatory question, maybe it should have been obvious to me. But is it the case that inflation and output gaps are being looked at at the product level of each product separately in the model you have?
No, you could define that. You can define inflation at the product level. You can define the output gap at the product level. We're interested in the aggregate, but you could define.
So when you said that, all that central bank has to do is to reduce inflation to zero.
Yes.
That's aggregate level.
Aggregate inflation.
Some prices could be negative, and still you would have output
Yes, but
equal to.
keep in mind that there are no idiosyncratic shocks in this version of the model, which means that eventually, after perhaps a transition, if the central bank fixes the aggregate price level, all firms will keep their price unchanged. And they will have the same price. Again, this is by symmetry, okay? Invoking symmetry. So, yeah, I'll say something about when we do optimal monetary policy, I'll say something more about this, okay? Because that turns out to be optimal under certain assumptions. Okay, very good. So these are the three equations again. We make some assumptions on the exogenous driving forces, and we can solve for the model using, standard techniques to solve for systems of stochastic difference equations, and we can look at how the economy responds to different shocks. Okay. Now, and I'll show you some simulations now. But before I show you these simulations, let me relate this to the framework, to the simple diagram that I've been using throughout my lecture this morning. Okay, so that you can see that there is some connection between the two. Okay, so this morning,
Sorry to interrupt.
yeah.
Sorry. Like for both IS curve and Phillips curve, we have the microfoundation. Like, is it possible for the Taylor rule as well? Because
No.
people don't.
You can show that it can approximate, under certain assumptions, it can approximate the optimal policy. But this is just a description. It's one example of a way that monetary policy can be conducted. You can assume whatever you want. Certainly, you can tell the central bank, follow the Taylor rule. Nothing wrong with that. No, you don't need micro foundations. It's just a policy decision. Now, an interesting question is how desirable. What are the optimal coefficients in the Taylor rule and so on? But you don't need micro foundations for that. You just say, okay, this is the way they behave.
So, in the Taylor rule, like the coefficients phi, subscript phi, phi y, all these can be like calibrated, right?
Yes,
But
and I will
saw
calibrate them.
in some of your paper that you have used a bar model to estimate this coefficient.
Well, you're ahead of me in terms of free papers. Here, now we can talk about this later. Now I'm a bit lost in what you're referring to. Here I'm going to assume as a baseline the coefficients that Taylor proposed as a good description of how monetary policy was conducted in the US. But we can play with that. You can do whatever you want. You could assume a constant money supply rule. I mean, there are many things that you could assume. Now let me say one thing before I turn to, have to control the time a bit, okay? Something that, again, to some of you, this may not be new, but to people who are not into this literature may find it very surprising. And I don't have any slide on this, but let me, now that I told you, look, these are the equilibrium. These are the equations that describe the equilibrium of this economy, in terms of three variables: nominal interest rate, the output gap, and inflation. I haven't said anything about money. Okay? I could have derived all these equations without introducing an asset called money. Okay, so this is what some people refer to as an example, as the cashless limit of the new Keynesian model. But it's very important because it says, what effectively it says is that if the central bank follows an interest rate rule, which is what we assume, and that's what central banks, at least must, certainly in advanced economies, most of them do, they have the interest rate as an instrument of monetary policy, short-term nominal rate, then money supply is irrelevant. Money supply will be adjusted so that the interest rate that we observe is the interest rate that they want to have. So when the Federal Reserve, yesterday, I believe, they chose not to change their official policy rate. Well, effectively, they don't do that by decree. They don't say, okay, from now on all the financial transactions at this maturity should be at 5.25% or whatever. No, they don't do that. They instruct the operations guys at the New York Fed and say, look, inject liquidity or withdraw liquidity from the system so that the equilibrium interest rate in the federal funds market is close to the one that we have chosen. Okay? So if you're not interested in the implementation, you can ignore completely money supply here. And that's what effectively you see in most applications of the new Keynesian model. Now, if you wanted to see the consequences of, say, following a constant money growth rule, then you would have to introduce money. You have to have a money demand and so on. That's just an aside remark in case some of you were wondering how can one talk about monetary policy without mentioning the word money or money supply at all. Of course, that's something that monetarists don't like at all. But,
with price action, those would be equivalent, right? If I choose a monetary growth and look at the corresponding, allow the interested to work out from the model,
yeah.
be choosing uninterested and allow the...
You could derive, the money supply rule that would, but that's not the way central banks work. Central banks adjust interest rates in response to developments in the economy. Here, it's just output and inflation, okay? That's the way they think about it. They don't think about, in fact, the Federal Reserve has stopped producing data on M1 and other monetary aggregates because they think, I think it was Greenspan who said, it's not that we have abandoned M1, it's that M1 has abandoned us because, it was behaving in a way that was completely, unrelated to inflation, so they stopped caring about monetary aggregates. Very good. So I said, let me relate this to the simple picture we had this morning. So what we had this morning was this perfectly competitive labor supply schedule, which that's unchanged because we're assuming, well, here I'm allowing for a wage markup, a constant wage markup, but the implicit assumption is that wages are flexible, okay? And this is the labor demand that we had. And now, suppose that we had a constant price markup, so sticky prices, flexible prices, but positive price markup. So the only thing it would do in terms of this diagram is to shift this labor demand to the left or downward, and with the size of the shift being given by the desired price markup. But the whole analysis would go through. Just the level of output or employment would be lower because of this imperfect market power in goods market, but the response to shocks would, the whole analysis that we covered this morning would go through. Okay? So the introduction of market power by itself doesn't do much. Okay? Other than making employment, lower than first best, okay? But not in terms of fluctuations. Now, introduce sticky prices on top of market power. So, introduction of sticky prices says that the price markup doesn't necessarily equal the desired price markup. It can deviate from it, okay? So, in terms of this diagram means that we can move, we can move along this ray here, no? And what would make the economy move around? Well, aggregate demand for goods. So that's the main insight from Keynes's general theory, okay? Employment is not determined by an equilibrium in the labor market, like the neoclassical view tells us it should. Employment, okay, is determined by the quantity of goods that firms want to produce, which in turn determined by aggregate demand. And then once the quantity of goods that firms want to produce is determined, then the technology, kind of trivially, determines the amount of labor that is needed to produce those goods. Okay? So, this equation that one could view as just a production function, but rewritten so that employment is on the left-hand side, that's how I want you to think of, under this view, as the labor demand schedule. Labor demand depends on the quantity of goods that firms want to produce, that in turn is determined by aggregate demand, and of course technology. Okay, for a given level of output that firms want to produce, the more productive is the technology, the less employment will be needed. No? So that will be key to understand some simulations that I will show you next. Okay, so for instance, if there is a decrease in aggregate demand, reduction in government purchases, individuals become more patient and they want to postpone consumption, whatever, a wave of pessimism that makes consumers want to consume less because they expect something terrible will happen in the future, whatever, then aggregate demand will shift to the right because output that firms want to produce will meet that change in aggregate demand, and hence the quantities of labor required will be reduced. Okay, so we will move from here to here, and since the price markup will be larger, that's fine. Firms are willing to accommodate that larger price markup because it has, as long as it's not obviously, as long as it's not huge, no, the deviation from the desired price markup. Okay. Very good. So we can calibrate the model. So I won't go over the details of the calibration. These are standard values for different parameters. Here I'm assuming these coefficients in the rule to be the ones that John Taylor assumed or argued provided a good description of monetary policy in the US. And we can look at the response to the three different shocks. Okay, so I'm going to focus just on the monetary policy shocks and technology shocks for the sake of time. So this is very small. You don't see anything, but I'll tell you what each box shows. Okay, so this is the shock, VT. That was that shock that was appended to the monetary policy, to the interest rate rule. This is exogenous, so I'm assuming that it increases and then it goes back to normal, to its steady state value. So this is what we would call a contractionary monetary policy shock. So suddenly, for no reason, the central bank raises the interest rate. Okay. How does the economy respond? Under flexible prices, we saw that the natural level of output was not affected by that, so one is neutral. But here we see that output goes down. Okay, so I mean the way to read this, 0 is the steady state. So output goes down and gradually returns to its initial value. So this generates a recession. Why is there a recession? Well, because the nominal rate goes up as a result of the shock, but prices are sticky. So expected inflation doesn't jump magically so that the real rate remains unchanged. Prices are sticky, expected inflation doesn't change much, so the real rate goes up. Okay? The increase in the real rate reduces, through the dynamic IS equation, reduces the quantity of consumption, hence the quantity of output that firms want to produce. Okay? And that leads to the decline in output. Okay? The output gap goes down too because the natural level of output is unchanged, so output gap and output, the response are the same. Employment goes down because firms want to produce less output. Technology has not changed, so they hire fewer workers. And inflation goes down, okay, persistently. Why does inflation go down? Well, because the decline in output reduces marginal costs, okay? Wages go down, in particular, marginal costs are reduced persistently, so firms that get to change the price will tend to lower the price, okay? Because current and expected marginal costs have gone down. And in order to keep markups at their desired value, at least on average, they will lower the price. So that's what generates persistent negative inflation. Here the steady state is assumed to be, inflation is assumed to be 0, okay? Or if you look at the price level, a gradual adjustment of the price level downward, a persistent impact. But it's gradual. And why is it gradual? Because each period only a fraction of firms adjust prices. So the aggregate price level adjusts gradually to the shock. It doesn't jump immediately to its long run level, okay? And also we observe something that we didn't emphasize this morning, but if we had introduced the monetary sector in the neoclassical model, we would have, the model would have implied that in response to a monetary policy shock, the money supply and the interest rate and inflation, they all move in the same direction, the nominal interest rate, okay? Whereas here, Okay, so here is, this simulation is with a version of the model in which I also introduce a money demand, and hence I can determine the money supply that will support the equilibrium. So here we see that the nominal rate goes up, but the money supply goes down. Okay, so that's what is known as the liquidity effect. The neoclassical model cannot generate this. But in the data, the data has many features of that are consistent with the predictions of the model. This is taken from a very famous paper by Cristiano Eichenbaum and Evans that looks at the responses of many variables, here I'm focusing on 4, to an exogenous monetary policy shock identified, I won't go into the details, through using a structural VAR. So the exogenous monetary policy shock is one that raises the federal funds rate persistently. That generates a recession, GDP. The price level adjusts, but only very gradually, okay? So it doesn't jump immediately to a long-run level. And the money supply, here M2, goes down, okay? So the nominal rate and the money supply move in opposite directions. That's the liquidity effect. So the three features can be captured by the new Keynesian model, qualitatively, obviously, okay? It's a very simple model. It's not meant to capture all the details of this, okay? So now let me turn to technology shock. Suppose there is a positive technology shock, an increase in A, okay, persistent increase in A. So what happens? Well, in the neoclassical model, we would observe a shift in the labor demand outward, employment would increase, output would increase, and so on. That's the basic mechanism behind fluctuations in the real business cycle model. So here we have this positive technology shock. Output increases. Okay, not surprisingly, output goes up when technology improves. But notice that the output gap goes down, becomes negative. So what does that mean? It means that output increases less than the natural level of output. It doesn't increase as much as it would with flexible prices. Well, that's a consequence of the specific interest rate rule that I have assumed. Okay, that Taylor rule. Okay, I could have played with the interest rate rule in a way to overturn that result. But once we assume a realistic, I would argue, interest rate rule, we get that result. And what is a result that it's very close to my heart, for reasons that I will show you in a second, that I find very interesting of this model, is that, again, it's not a general result, but for reasonable calibration of the model, it's a pretty robust result. In response to the positive technology shock that increases output, employment goes down. Okay, here it goes down from, 0 is the steady state, to a negative value, and only gradually it recovers, and it goes back to a steady state. Now, why is this interesting? It's just out of curiosity. Well, it's interesting because, here's why it's so close to my heart. There is some empirical evidence by myself and others that suggests that this is actually what happens in actual economies in response to technology shocks. Okay, so this uses a structural VAR with long-run restrictions. I won't bother you with the details. And what you see on the left-hand side, no, actually, all the boxes show the response of different variables to a positive technology shock. So a positive technology shock increases productivity. 0 is always the initial value. Increases productivity permanently. That's not surprising. Okay. It increases GDP gradually. Okay. But in the short run, it lowers hours. Okay. In a way consistent with the predictions of the new Keynesian model. Okay. It also reduces inflation, as the model predicts, and so on. Now, why is this evidence? And let me show you so that you don't think this is only the result of some whimsical exercise that I did. This is a different paper using a completely different methodology by Sue Fernald and Kimball, the AER, this one. Both are in the AER, yeah. That shows the same result. This is using direct measures of technology, the Fernald measures of technology, and just regressing different variables on current and lagged values of the innovations to that measure of technology. So we see that a positive technology shock increases output, okay? But in the short run, it reduces hours, and it also reduces employment, and so on. Okay? So why is this important? I mean, it's important for two reasons. First, the two are a bit for insiders in a sense. No, I'm not sure that this would be very important for the general public, but I think it's very important for two reasons. One, in terms of evaluation of the relative merits of the two frameworks, the neoclassical, or real business cycle, and the new Keynesian model. Okay? It says, look, the evidence suggests that the new Keynesian model can explain the effects of technology shocks, but the real business cycle model cannot. Okay, so that's one thing. But even if you don't, you don't believe these models, you're not particularly interested in this, as if it was a fight or a race between the two models and so on. This is interesting in itself because it tells you that technology shocks cannot be an important source of economic fluctuations, independently of whatever model you have in mind. Why? Well, because this tells you that technology shocks generate a negative co-movement between hours of work and employment and output. And if there is a distinctive feature of economic fluctuations, universal distinctive feature is that at business cycle frequencies, hours of work, employment, whatever, measures of labor input can move positively with output. So a corollary of this is that other shocks other than technology, must be the sources of those fluctuations. Okay? And this is independent of the model of one's preferred model. Maybe a real business cycle model, driven by fiscal shocks, may be a good explanation to economic fluctuations. Okay, very good. So the analysis so far was positive, in the sense that we looked at some of the predictions of the model under an interest rate rule, power because of sticky prices. Okay, so far I'm restricting myself to a model with sticky prices but flexible wages. So define this variable xt, which is the gap between output and the efficient level of output. So the efficient level of output, that's what Mike Woodford termed the welfare relevant output gap. Efficient level of output may be different from the natural level of output because of market power, for instance. Okay. Well, a very powerful result that was derived by Rothenberg and Woodford in '97, and this is just an application to the symbol framework that I'm playing with now, is the following. Up to a second order, the welfare losses of the representative household in this environment that I have described take this form. Okay? So they are a function of this output gap. Okay, so these are the first order term. Okay, so if there's a deviation of output from the efficient level of output, so if you increase output, you reduce welfare losses up to first order. And also there are second order terms that involve the volatility of the output gap and the volatility of inflation. And these are terms independent of policy. That's what TIP means. Okay? So this is very useful because it can be used to evaluate alternative policies. You can simulate the model under alternative monetary policy rules, and then you can just evaluate the welfare losses, and hence you can rank different monetary policy strategies and so on. Okay? So let's look at some simple cases as an illustration. Okay? So suppose this is the case of an efficient natural equilibrium. Suppose that the natural equilibrium, that is the equilibrium under flexible prices, was efficient. You can say, no, it's not possible because you also have monopolistic competition. Well, we can offset monopolistic competition, we can fix monopolistic competition, say by introducing a subsidy that completely offsets it, okay? Just as a part of the thought experiment. So that the only distortion or imperfection that is left uncorrected is the presence of sticky prices, okay? So in that case, the natural level of output equals the efficient level of output, the welfare relevant output gap equals the output gap. This term, this term vanishes because this term, this big theta here, recaptured the degree of inefficiency of the steady state. In the steady state, if we correct for monopolistic competition, the steady state will be efficient, so this term drops out. So we can write down welfare losses like this, okay? It's a function only of the volatility of the output gap and the volatility of inflation. What is the optimal policy in this world? Very simple. Fully stabilize inflation and fully stabilize the output gap, both at zero. You will replicate the flexible price equilibrium, which is efficient, okay? And the central bank, how do you implement that? The central bank, this is an interest rate rule that would implement it. The central bank should adjust the nominal interest rate in response to changes in the natural rate of interest, 1-for-1, and in response to inflation. One can show that if the central bank follows this rule, then this will be the unique outcome, as long as this is larger than 1, that's the so-called Taylor principle, okay? So this is, if you want, a very, under very strong assumptions, but it's a theoretical justification of inflation targeting strategies followed by central banks all over the world, no? You don't need central banks to care about inflation, to have some obsession about inflation since they were born or something like that. No. Central banks want to maximize households' welfare, and that leads them to fully stabilize the price level, and that automatically, that's the divine coincidence result, will stabilize output at the efficient level of output. Okay? Very good. Now, okay, so that's one result. Now, is this a general result? No, this very strong result is a consequence of this assumption, okay? That the natural level of output is efficient, okay? If we relax that assumption, then, let me skip this, then the problem becomes more complicated because, then the divine coincidence goes away, and one can write down the new Keynesian-Phillips curve like this. Okay, so here you have the welfare-relevant output gap, which is what enters the loss function of the central bank, inflation, but there is a term here, UT, that involves the fluctuations in the gap between the natural level of output and the efficient level of output. So here there's a trade-off. In order to stabilize inflation, the central bank would want to keep output as close as possible to the natural level of output. But of course, that may imply large deviations from the efficient level of output, and those generate welfare losses as well. So, what is the optimal policy? It's one that attains some kind of compromise between the two, and that will depend on parameter values, okay? Because that's an interesting result in this literature. The relative weight of the output gap and inflation in welfare losses depends on parameter values, okay? So in particular, fluctuations in inflation will be more costly if the elasticity of substitution between goods is high and if price stickiness is high, okay? Because then that lambda would be small, so this coefficient would be large. And the reason is that if prices are very sticky, then if there is inflation, that means that some firms, a few firms, are adjusting their prices a lot, and that generates large relative price distortions. If the elasticity of substitution between goods is high, those relative price distortions will be reflected in large quantity dispersions that is inefficient. Okay, because there's no reason why, goods should be produced in different goods should be produced in different quantities because everything is symmetric, by construction.
I might have missed this, but what is causing them to adjust prices if this is true? If you're at the efficient national equilibrium?
If you're at the efficient, because in this other case, in the interesting case, or in this case that I said it's more realistic. In this case, if you're at the efficient, suppose that the central bank could steer the economy towards the efficient. But if there is a gap between the efficient level of output and the natural level of output, that means that output will be different from the natural level of output. Okay? Yes. But if output is different from the natural level of output, that means that the markup will be different from the desired markup. And hence, firms that are allowed to adjust prices will either increase prices or lower prices, so we will have positive inflation or negative inflation depending on the sign.
Yeah, that I understand. But in the efficient case...
Oh, in the efficient case...
Why is inflation happening in the efficient
No, inflation may happen because the central bank may conduct policy in a way that the output gap is different from zero, which means that the markup gap will be different from zero. That is, the markups will differ from the desired markups. And to the extent that markups differ from desired markups, firms that adjust prices will change their prices.
But if they didn't, if there was no policy intervention, could that still happen?
Well, the central bank has to do something. Maybe not. Could be. Suppose that the central bank followed some arbitrary rule. To the extent that the output gap differs in response to shocks, there has to be some shock. Okay. In response to some shock, the output may change, and markups will differ, or marginal costs may change in response to technology shocks, and markups will differ from desired markups. And as long as markups will differ from desired markups, and this will happen very generally in response to shocks if you have sticky prices, then there will be positive inflation or negative inflation.
But then you're not at Y.
No, then we're deviating from this. That would be a suboptimal outcome. This is the optimal policy.
Yes.
So under the optimal policy, the central bank does whatever it takes so that inflation is at zero at all times, which means that the output gap will also be at zero, which means that output will be at the efficient level. And that's the first best. Okay, so that's why I said that this justifies strict inflation targeting policies. Of course, it's an extreme example.
I suppose what I don't understand is that overall inflation is an average, right? Of these firms that are, they could be doing all sorts of things that will get inflation to zero, but they still will be.
But no one, if the central bank, suppose that we start from steady state, all firms have the same prices. A shock hits the economy. If the central bank follows this policy, no firm will want to adjust prices. So they will be happy with the prices they have. There will be no inflation. The flexible price equilibrium will be replicated. Okay. If we start from a steady state in which there is dispersion, there is a transition and so on, it's a bit complicated. But this is the basic point for our purposes. Okay. Very good. So let me skip this and say something. I want to say something about sticky wages. Okay. So far I have assumed that wages were flexible. Okay, so we can introduce sticky wages in the framework. This is the first authors that extended the framework to sticky wages were Isaac Henderson and Levin, and in a way that is symmetric to prices. Okay, so we have differentiated labor services. Okay, think of different occupations, plumbers, electricians, doctors, and so on. And each occupation is represented by a union. And unions set wages, nominal wages, but they cannot adjust the wage continuously, only with a certain probability. Okay, and they have market power. Okay, and this is the probability of resetting the wage. So theta W can be thought of as a measure of wage stickiness. Okay, so similar equations hold for optimal wage setting rule. Now, under flexible wages, the wage would be chosen. Let's see, I have here. Under flexible wages, the nominal wage would be chosen so that the wage markup is constant. The markup of the real wage, move PT to the left-hand side. Okay, the real wage would be a constant wage markup over the marginal rate of substitution under flexible wages. Under sticky wages, the nominal wage is chosen so that it's equal to a markup, desired markup, over a weighted average of current and expected price-adjusted marginal rates of substitution. So not only the current value of the price-adjusted marginal rate of substitution, but also expectations for the same reasons that we had with prices, because unions recognize that the wage that they set today will remain effective for a while. Again, this is the difference equation describing the evolution of the wage, and we get an equation for the wage inflation that looks exactly like the equation we had for price inflation. But now it's a function of the gap between the average wage markup in the economy and the desired wage markup, but the intuition is exactly the same. Very good. Now you can combine, the rest of the model is the same. Now this is the way the three equation turns into a five equation model. One can solve it, and a number of, okay, so this is the way it would look in terms of our labor market diagram. Okay? So here was the original, if you want, the neoclassical equilibrium. If you just assume monopolistic competition in goods markets and labor markets, you just have a shift of labor demand and labor supply, but nothing else changes, okay? The response to shocks will be the same, okay? If that markup remains constant. Okay, but what's interesting is that now, in response to changes in aggregate demand, those shifts in this green line, okay, we can have, the economy may move from this equilibrium, that was the steady state, to say this point, any point in this region. The direction in which it moves, whether the real wage is here or the real wage is here, will depend on the relative stickiness of wages and prices, okay? On the two Phillips curves, the wage Phillips curve and the price Phillips curve. Okay, but it could go if it can go either way. Okay, and one interesting result. So these are the responses to a monetary policy shock, and here just look at the blue lines. That's the model with sticky prices and sticky wages. You can see in response to a monetary policy shock that reduces output substantially. Okay. The real wage hardly changes. So this is consistent with the idea that the real wage is largely cyclical. Why does the real wage hardly change? Because, both prices and wages are sticky, but in addition to the exogenous stickiness, there is an endogenous stickiness. Even those workers that can adjust their wage, they will not adjust it by much. Why? Because they know that the price will hardly change. And those firms that are allowed to adjust their price will not change it much because they know that the wage will hardly change. The wage is an important component of marginal cost. Okay, so that's an endogenous stickiness that makes the real wage hardly change. Again, that's consistent with this acyclicality of the real wage. Very good. Let me just take one very quickly, because I want to say something about this wage flexibility puzzle, about the normative aspects. Okay. So now, once you introduce wage stickiness, the second-order approximation to welfare losses is given by this expression as the output gap, price inflation. I use a P now, but also wage inflation. Okay. So wage fluctuations in wage inflation matter. So in this case, one can show that it's impossible to replicate the first best when both sticky prices and sticky wages are present. Okay, so there's always some kind of compromise. Okay, and it can be shown. Well, in the limiting cases, so if you have flexible wages and sticky prices, that's what we had seen earlier. The optimal policy is a strict price inflation targeting. If you have flexible prices but sticky wages, the optimal policy is a strict wage inflation targeting. But more generally, one can show that the nearly optimal policy is one that stabilizes a weighted average of price inflation and wage inflation, where the weights depend on the relative stickiness of prices and wages. Okay? So the more sticky a variable is, the larger is the weight attached to the stabilization of inflation of that variable. Okay? So, very good. So now let me take the few minutes that I have just to make to show you through an example how different this new Keynesian perspective on fluctuations can be from, in terms of its implications, from the logic of the neoclassical model. Okay. So wage flexibility, it's an illustration. So the conventional view about wage flexibility, the one that, the IMF and other institutions, the OECD, the European Commission, they're always, pontificating about is that wage flexibility is good. I mean, in general, labor market flexibility is good, wage flexibility is good, and so on. Where does this conventional view come from? Okay, well, from a very simple diagram, like the one we've been using of the labor market, that you probably learn in introductory economics, no? That implicitly or explicitly it assumes the neoclassical assumptions, no? Perfect competition and flexible prices, flexible wages. Okay, so suppose that we're here. So in this is the equilibrium. Then there's an adverse shock, okay, that shifts the labor demand to the left. Well, if wages are flexible, like in the classical world, we would move from A to B. If wages were sticky, because maybe some government regulation or whatever, we would move from A to C. Then the argument would say, look, it's better to have flexible wages because the impact of the shock on employment will be smaller. Okay? Why? Because with flexible wages, the wages will be reduced, and that will compensate, since labor demand depends on the wage, that's key. Labor demand depends on the wage, that will compensate for the adverse shock to demand. And to the extent that we think that stable employment is good, okay, then this would be desirable. Now, does this work in the under a New Keynesian perspective? No. Because under the New Keynesian perspective, labor demand doesn't depend on the wage, not directly at least. Okay? Labor demand depends on the quantity of output that is demanded and that the firms want to produce. So we could have a shift in this aggregate demand that will lead to a reduction in output and in employment, okay? Reduction in employment, and that reduction in employment will be the same if the wage remains unchanged or if the wage declines a bit. Okay? Because the wage does not have a direct impact on labor demand. So, does that mean that the wage is completely irrelevant in the New Keynesian model in terms of determining employment or stabilizing employment? The answer is no. But the mechanism is very different. So here's the mechanism. How does a change in the nominal wage end up affecting employment? Suppose that there is a decrease in the nominal wage. Unions decide to lower the wage because there has been an adverse shock and so on, and they think, let's stimulate employment. That wouldn't happen, you say. Okay, well, let's switch the signs then. Okay, so suppose the nominal wages, or if you want, doesn't increase as much as it would in other circumstances. Well, that will reduce marginal costs, and that will tend to reduce inflation because firms that get to adjust prices will tend to lower prices, and that will lower inflation. The reduction in inflation, depending on the monetary policy rule in place, suppose a Taylor rule, would lead to a reduction in interest rates. Since prices are sticky, a reduction in the nominal interest rate will imply a reduction in the real rate. The reduction in the real rate will stimulate aggregate demand. That will stimulate the output that firms want to produce, and that will stimulate employment. So it's a long chain of causality. But the basic point, and the one that I want to emphasize, is that this impact is mediated critically by the response of the central bank to inflation. So depending on how strong the response of the central bank to inflation is, we will have a larger impact or not of the change in the wage on employment. Okay? So imagine that the central bank follows this Taylor rule. Okay? So this is from a paper of mine in the Journal of the European Economic Association. So this shows welfare losses as a function of the inflation coefficient. Okay, so this would be more aggressive response to inflation, less aggressive response to inflation. Okay, and this is the wage stickiness parameter. So this is completely sticky wages. This is fully flexible wages. And now think about increasing wage flexibility. Okay, and these are welfare losses, the vertical axis. So suppose that we're in this region here, where the central bank responds strongly to inflation. We see that the more flexible wages are, the smaller welfare losses are. So that's consistent with the conventional view. Wage flexibility is desirable. But why? Well, because that mechanism works well. Okay, because there's a strong response of the central bank here. But now suppose that the response of the central bank to inflation is smaller. Okay, coefficient close to 1. You see? An increase in wage flexibility increases welfare losses. Why is that? Because an increased wage flexibility in that case has little impact on the stabilization of employment, but on the other hand, it leads to more volatility of wage inflation, causes welfare losses, and more volatility of marginal costs and hence of price inflation that also causes welfare losses. Okay, so in the context of the model, it leads to an increase in welfare losses monotonically. Then intermediate cases, you can see that it's non-monotonic. So depending on where you are, an increase in wage flexibility may be desirable or not. So there are other examples. So this applies to other examples in which the central bank may not respond strongly to changes in inflation. Just to mention, without showing you the pictures, suppose that you are in a fixed exchange rate regime, okay? Or in a currency union, a small country in a currency union. You're hit by a shock that increases inflation in your country, but the central bank doesn't respond by adjusting the interest rate. Because the central bank has, you no longer have a central bank if you're in a currency union, like the euro area, or because the central bank has another objective in mind, which is to keep the exchange rate pegged. So it has to just peg the interest rate to the foreign interest rate. Okay, so in that case, this mechanism, this stabilization mechanism of flexible wages will not work, and you can get an increase in wage flexibility. For this is in a currency union, you see can have these non-monotonic effects on welfare losses. So for a certain range, it can lead to an increase in welfare losses, whereas if the central bank was completely independent and followed an inflation targeting under this calibration that we have here in my paper with Monacelli, an increase in wage flexibility would always lower welfare losses. And another example is a zero lower bound. In case of for whatever reason the central bank is stuck at the zero lower bound, maybe an increase in inflation, but the central bank may choose not to respond to that, and the same will apply. Okay, so in a paper with Roberto Billi, we made this point. Okay, so let me skip this, and just to conclude, so the basic message that I wanted to convey is that, in order to understand economic fluctuations, we need to depart from the neoclassical paradigm, okay, the one that adopted by real business cycle models, and that I have, my role here was that of a salesman, and I tried to convince you that the new Keynesian model can be a useful framework. It's among the many departures that one can think of. This is one that we think is realistic and useful to help us understand fluctuations and how central banks can respond to those fluctuations. And a key element is this idea of elastic markups, okay, that firms and workers are willing to accept departures from their desired markups, and that gives rise to a central role for aggregate demand, and hence to monetary policy in determining output and employment. An important lesson of all this is that this is something that I always, preach to my students, that in this world, there are no unconditional predictions. It makes no sense to ask in an exam, what is the impact of a positive technology shock in a new Keynesian economy? No. You always have to condition on the monetary policy rule in place. Different monetary policy rules will have very different implications. If you let me play with the monetary policy rule, I can generate all kinds of exotic results, okay? So that's important, no? The no prediction is invariant to the monetary policy rule in place. And let me now, just to conclude, truly conclude, let me say something about the representative agent assumption. For many years, until recently, the new Keynesian framework had adopted the fiction, useful, convenient fiction of an infinitely lived representative agent. Now, in recent years, many of you may be aware of this, there has been a new industry that has emerged in which people associate, call it Hank models, heterogeneous agent new Keynesian models, in which heterogeneity is introduced. So this is interesting because, in the context of real business cycle models, heterogeneity was introduced by some authors, Victor Rios-Roy and others, Per Cruzel, and the conclusion that they reached is that it didn't make much difference. Okay, so that's why it was abandoned, and Macro continued with the representative agent fiction. But that's not true in new Keynesian models. So why is that? Because in neoclassical models, output is largely determined by the supply side. A key implication of heterogeneity in households, say, is that different households will have different marginal propensities to consume. But if output is determined on the supply side, it doesn't matter if you shift resources from some households to others, even if they have different marginal propensities to consume, because output is determined on the supply side. But that's not true in new Keynesian models, which output is determined largely by the aggregate demand side. So if you shift resources from households with a low marginal propensity to consume to others with a high marginal propensity to consume, that will affect aggregate consumption, aggregate output, aggregate employment, and so on. So that's why this gives rise to many interesting implications that have to do with, the effects of any shock are mediated by how that shock leads to a redistribution of resources across households that have different marginal propensities to consume. And also, it also implies that, say, income policies, like minimum wages, or this notion of basic income and so on, can be used as a stabilization tools. Okay? Whereas in a neoclassical model, it wouldn't have, they wouldn't have particular interest. Very good, so that's it. I'm sorry I went over time a bit, okay? And again, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to address them. I don't know if we have time for questions, but otherwise, thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Gali. I think we've run out of time, but we've had a very interactive session, so I thank you for that, and maybe we can continue in the lawns over tea and also later tonight. Yes. So thank you so much.
Very good. Thank you.
Couple of announcements. At the end of tomorrow's panel session at around 5:30, we are going to announce the winners of the 3 categories in Best Paper Awards. So everybody is supposed to be around to clap for the winners. So that's one. And receive the prize, of course. And number 2, the bus for the dinner for the invitees are going to leave from the campus at 6, so please be around the parking lot. For logistical and other concerns, we could not invite everyone to the conference dinner, but I hope it's understandable. Thank you.
I now request our esteemed chairperson, Professor Pamidua, to please remain seated.
Okay.
On.
Please for light printer. Yes, thank you.
Can you see me?
Can you see me?
Thank you.
She was getting covered.
Yes.
Oh, that's very
This
useful.
Diamond Jubilee celebration of
Yes,
telescope. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much.
you so much.
Sure. Okay, sir. I understand.